Hey, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. Feel free to take a moment to settle in, get a glass of water, do a little stretch, whatever you need for these few minutes in the afternoon before we get started. I do want to thank everybody for joining us today. It's going to be a really interesting event. We've got some great perspectives from all across Canada, which is, you don't always get that on some of these national calls. So we're lucky to be joined by experts from coast to coast to coast. So to kick things off, I'm just going to start with a bit of a land acknowledgement. So I am joining the call here from Ottawa, Ontario. And what that means is that I'm joining from the unceded surrendered territories of the Algonquin Nation. It's important, I think, when we do these land acknowledgements to not only reflect on the land we're joining from, but what it means to be a settler working on energy systems here in Canada. So whatever that means for you, whatever that inspires for you, feel free to reflect on it, share any thoughts in the chat, and our panelists will have a chance also to speak on that when we start our questions. In terms of housekeeping for our event today, the way this is all going to work is we are going to start with a national overview of the context from Abby about his really amazing report that was just released by Efficiency Canada. And Abby, if you have the link handy, I'm going to call on you to share that in the chat to show folks what we've been working on and what we've been thinking about here at Efficiency Canada. And after that, we are going to go to the rest of our amazing panelists. And I've got some questions pre-written. There's some things that I want to hear about. And then after that, we're going to open it up to everybody on the call to submit your questions. If anything comes up throughout the call, we'd love some sidebars in the chat. If there's resources you want to share, any thoughts that come up. But if you do have questions for the panelists, you have a Q&A button in the bottom of your screen. So you can put your questions in there throughout the call and we will get to them in the latter half of the event. The event is recorded and we have a hard cutoff time at 1:45 Eastern today. With that, I do want to do a quick poll. I'm curious to see where folks are joining from today. So you'll see that on your screen there. So it's more regional. We're not asking which specific province, but I'm wanting to know which general part of the country you are joining from today. So I think we've got a lot of people answering, just waiting for one or two more. And after that, I will share it so everyone can see the results, but it looks like we've got quite a few joining from out west, which is great. A few in central, some from the eastern, and nobody from the territories. So if you know anyone who's in the territories, send them an invite. Let's get them on the call. Here we go. So now everyone can see that's kind of the regional breakdown that we're looking at here today. And with that, I'm going to do some intros so everyone knows who we get to hear from today on our call. I apologize if you can hear the street sweeper going by in my background. So our national overview is going to come from Abby, who is a research associate with Efficiency Canada. And then our four panelists are Areef, who is the founder and president of Create Climate Equity. We're also joined by Edmundo, who's the sustainability coordinator with the City of St. John's. We have Jacqueline, who's speaking on behalf of the Low Income Energy Network, and Thea Campbell, who's the rebate programs manager with efficiencyPEI. So lots of expertise in the room, lots of different perspectives, and we're lucky to have them all here. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Abby, who's going to give us that national overview and a little glimpse into the report that he just put out this week to frame our discussion. Over to you.
Thanks, Kirstin. So this is going to be very brief because I have 5 minutes of time for the longer, director's cut, if you will. The video from my last week's discovery is up on our website. So we took a look at provincial programs, provincial low-income energy efficiency programs, provincial territorial programs around the country with the view of giving federal government some policy advice and lessons. So the reason we did this is because low-income energy efficiency matters, and it matters now. Low-income households are more likely to experience energy poverty, and energy poverty is the condition where households face challenges meeting their home energy needs, paying their bills on time, or making the necessary upgrades to cut their long-term energy costs. Low-income households are more likely to experience it, but it doesn't mean that it's only caused by low incomes. It's also caused by high energy rates and or a combination of living in inefficient homes. Paradoxically, households that can use and benefit from energy efficiency the most are also least likely to be able to A, afford upfront costs to pay for energy efficiency measures, or B, even if you give them, for example, a no interest loan, as the federal government is planning to do, they may not be in a position to assume more debt burden. So we need tailored approaches to reach these low-income households. And we thought we'd take a look at provincial programs to see what they're doing, what they're good at, what gaps there might be, and give advice to the federal government. So I'll just run through real quick. What we observed is that nearly every single province in the country, with the exception of Alberta, has a low income energy efficiency program. So what that means is your eligibility for the program is based on some definition of what constitutes to be low income. And then when you qualify, your household will receive no cost turnkey upgrades or very low cost turnkey upgrades that are managed for you by trained professionals and who would come and do the installation for the most part. These are the types of programs we observed through the country. We focused on the first three on the first row here because those are most common. So self-installed programs are, if you're a low-income household and you qualify, you get sent like a little energy savings kit, LED lights, weather stripping, faucet aerators and so on. Direct install programs are programs that start with like someone will come to your home, they'll do a home energy assessment, walk around and then give you customized advice on what you should and shouldn't do in your home to save energy use, give you a couple of the same kind of things, weather stripping, this and that. The last would be, are more common in the sort of the Atlantic provinces are major upgrades. So weather stripping, basement insulation, wall insulation, attic insulation, upgrading upgrading equipment or furnaces and so on. So these are like the common types of programs. And just to give you quick numbers at this, so what we observed is that the direct install program, so that we send you an energy saving kit, reach up to 3% of eligible low income households in that particular province. Minor upgrade programs are actually on par with just like normal ability to pay residential rates. So under 1% is roughly how often even the ability to pay markets participates in low income energy efficiency programs. And what's encouraging is that we see that, even with major upgrades, with dedicated funding and support and a good program design, program administrators are able to reach 1 or 2% of households, even though they invest a lot per household, they're able to achieve deeper savings. So that's about 15 to 30% of an average home's energy use being cut down for every house that participates in this program. What we observed is that the strengths of the programs are really good at engaging. So around 55,000 low-income Canadians are participating in a low-income energy efficiency program every year. That's a big number. That's nothing to sneer at. Programs are really good at connecting with households that are experiencing low energy poverty, or I should say, what I should say is that programs are leveraging local connections and networks to reach low-income households, and this would be extremely difficult for a federal government to replicate at scale. No two provincial programs are alike. They are a function of the local relationships and the institutional knowledge they have. Federal government unleashing a whole new program is unlikely to replicate the success of existing provincial programs. The gaps are, and I want to be very careful about this, the programs are good at what they're asked to do. This isn't to knock on existing programs, but to identify that there's two gaps that the federal government is in the national interest. One is lifting households out of energy poverty, making sure that net zero transitions are fair and we're leaving no one behind. And two is to actually get to net zero by 2050. So these are the gaps that are in relation to those two big goals. So one is that while they are reaching a lot of households, the savings per households are too shallow to lift households out of energy poverty or to reach net zero emissions. Same thing with fuel switching. There aren't many programs that, given the opportunity and technical feasibility, and even if it's cheaper, there aren't many programs that would switch like a fossil fuels heating system into, let's say, a hybrid heat pump. And actually the most pernicious aspect of one of the most challenging aspects of this is some of the lowest income households who may need structural upgrades like mold remediation and stuff are not able to participate in most programs because existing programs don't have a mandate or a budget to make structural upgrades to a home, even if those are preconditions for being able to make energy efficiency upgrades. And the last thing is that not many households are targeting, there's income-based eligibility, but not many are looking at, okay, who among them is actually facing the highest energy burden or living in the least efficient home? Or, for example, could be seniors or newcomers or immigrants who, like me, maybe have trouble navigating systems of support and so on, right? So these are the gaps. So finally, the recommendations that we made at the federal role, and we'll hear from our panel, the rest of the panel today, what their role is at the provincial level. At the federal role, are taking together our recommendations are like, just don't keep tinkering and coming up with new programs, work with existing programs, just give them high-level targets and say, you need to get to X% net zero, you need to lift X number of households of energy poverty, and trust existing programs to be able to pivot to meet those goals. Don't come up with a whole new program, act as an enabler or as someone who lifts up the ambition of existing programs and not unleash a whole new program on the marketplace, which causes confusion, duplication of third party, this and that, and so on. So that's the larger context. This is what's happening at the national level. And for a more detailed presentation, I would encourage you to go back I'll link that up in the chat if it's available. Thanks, Kirstin. I'm sorry if I went over a little bit, but thank you.
All good. It's worth it for the good data. So that's our federal context, right? That's the overall, the big picture, but we know Canada is a big old country with different stories in every single province. And even, in one city to another city within a province, there's different stories. And so what we want to dive into today is some of those provincial stories, what's working, what are some of the challenges. And so I'm going to dive in to ask our panelists our first question with just one more comment. If you have a question for Abby, we will be coming back to that at the end of the event. So Q&A is the place to put those. So the first question for me, for everybody on our panel today is, what's unique about your context? You're all joining from a different province. What's unique in the province that you are working in? And we're going to start with Edmundo for this question.
Thank you very much, Kirstin, and everybody who attended, who's tuning in today. I would like to first acknowledge the province of Newfoundland and Labrador as ancestral homeland of the Beothuk, which is where I'm coming to you from. I'm in these lands that are basically now home to a very diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples, which in history it included the Mi'kmaq, the Innu and Inuit and Southern Inuit and of the province. But sadly, we have a pretty rough history in Newfoundland and Labrador with the relationship. But with that note, actually, Newfoundland and Labrador has a really unique composition, actually. We're made up of about 278 municipalities, which is significantly more in number than many other provinces. And not because we have a larger population, obviously, but just because of how we're composed. And basically, if you were to break that down, you're looking at 3 cities, 270 towns, and 5 Inuit communities. And basically, we don't have a regional government kind of structure like you do in Ontario or in other jurisdictions. And population-wise, we have a bit of a semi-unique kind of composition, because about 23% of our population it's in the category of 65 years and older, which is actually I think is one of the highest rates provincially in the country. And from our energy systems, we don't have natural gas infrastructure underground, so we don't have piped gas to any facility. But we do have an upcoming ample low carbon energy resource, mostly through hydro, that we're kind of wrestling with. And from a home perspective, we have a bit of a different picture in some ways, because actually most of our residents actually own their home. So they will have a fairly high average, well above average in Canada household ownership, but we also have nearly twice the amount of many households facing energy poverty than in the rest of Canada. So I think we're the second province with the highest energy poverty issue. So we almost, in the short picture, we don't have natural gas. We're very far apart from each other with a lot of space, which is a benefit in some cases, but brings in some challenges. And our properties usually are a little bit older, but most of the families own their home. However, most of those owners of the homes are actually in their older years of life, which makes sometimes some of these decisions of return on investment a little bit different. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Perfect. And we'll pass it to Thea next.
Great. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. My name is Thea, and I work at EfficiencyPEI, which is a part of the government of Prince Edward Island. And while my work is specifically with EfficiencyPEI, a lot of the answers that I'll give today span the work that the other departments are doing in the government. What is unique about the context on PEI? So EfficiencyPEI is PEI's energy efficiency agency, and we provide energy programs and services to all islanders in all sectors for all fuel types. So all of the programming is housed in one organization, which that's not the case in some other provinces and territories. And there can be a lot of dovetailing because we're a big organization and it all lives in one place. Because EfficiencyPEI was branded in 2016 and the incentives have been in place for over a decade, many islanders and contractors already know about our services. So we have pretty robust relationships and processes already in place, and that served us really well when Greener Homes launched last year, and we were able to be pretty nimble to respond to the increased subscription of people that wanted to go through efficiency programs. And hopefully it puts us in a really good place to expand our offering over the next little while to reach the net zero goals that we have on the island.
Thanks, Thea. And next we'll hear from Areef.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm speaking to you from Vancouver Island, the ancestral land of the Coast Salish people. I'm grateful to be here. In terms of what's unique about our province, I think the province has a long history of low-income programs, relatively long. I personally used to work in low-income programs in the UK before I came to Canada, and then also was involved in actually delivering BC Hydro's first program. But the actual sort of lobbying of government and the province and the utilities started around about 93. The first program came through from the utilities in about 2009. So there's been a long history of it. It's been bumpy. The program's been bumpy, and we can talk more about that. But there's a general acceptance that this is a really, at the commission and at the government, at the provincial government level, that this is important work to do. So, and the province has just launched another program, a clean energy BC has, and we can talk more about that if questions, people are interested in learning more about that.
Perfect, thanks, Areef. And then to close this question off, we'll go to Jacqueline.
Thank you very much. My name is Jacqueline. I'm here on behalf of the Low Income Energy Network. I'm speaking from what is now called Toronto, and it's my understanding that these are the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. And because I live in a big urban center, I did also want to recognize the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples who live here from different nations all over the place, and many of whom have been pushed off their lands by settlers, and there's a very violent history underlying all of this. In terms of the energy poverty system in Ontario, I wanted to highlight a few interesting things about our context. One is that we have a pretty good jumping off point currently. We have a framework that includes emergency assistance, on-bill payments, energy efficiency programs, and consumer protection rules for low-income people. And so that is already in place. And so in the Ontario context, we're really talking about improving all of those programs and in terms of reach and what they cover. The background of the Ontario story is also a little bit interesting. So briefly, our gas and electricity regulator, the Ontario Energy Board, initially did not recognize and did not look at low income and affordability issues. And the Low Income Energy Network started to raise concerns about energy poverty programs at Ontario Energy Board hearings. And we're told a few times that it wasn't the right place or that wasn't the appropriate forum, and eventually got a ruling on that issue in 2007. So quite a few years ago now. And we challenged that decision in court, and the court agreed with us that it was in fact in the jurisdiction of our regulator to look at low income programs. And so that really opened the door for moving forward with energy poverty programs. And then the other piece, along with sort of the court intervention that happened, is that in Ontario, we've had a lot of directives from the Provincial Energy Ministry on energy poverty issues and low-income programs. And the extent of sort of the direct political involvement in Ontario is sort of notable. And it really, again, it is responsible for opening the door to energy poverty programs. But of course, it comes with a downside, which is that it's political and it can, change with politics. So those are sort of two pieces of the Ontario story that are of some interest and somewhat unique across the country.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, such different stories, that in such different systems and such different structures and histories. I think one thing I'd like to know, there's a lot to learn, I think, from the challenges we're facing, but there's also a lot we can learn from each other about what's working well. So I'd love to hear from each of you about what's something or a few things that are working really well in your province. And we'll start with Thea.
Thanks. Just over a year ago, the government of Prince Edward Island started building the Office of Net Zero. This office focused on wide sweeping strategies for transportation, agriculture, buildings, and industry. And this work, it has a focus, a mandate for lower income islanders. The province proclaimed the Net Zero Carbon Act, which focuses, and I quote, on the creation of conditions supporting an inclusive economy, which I was surprised that this is an act. And so an inclusive economy is defined as one that generates opportunities for all segments of the population. We also released the 2040 Net Zero Framework, which has a guiding principle that our transition to net zero is fair and equitable. So over the next 20 years, we will release 5-year action plans to guide our programming. And it was through this work that we ended up launching the free heat pump program, which provides free heat pumps to islanders with an income of less than $35,000. And it was just announced recently that as we move through sort of the tiers of people who are eligible, it will be moved up to 40,000. And so all of this work that, because we're in the government and we're connected to all of the other pieces of government, the net zero work also dovetails with the government's diversity and inclusion strategy and the work of the Poverty Reduction Council. Yeah, I think that's all I'll say. We're doing net zero things, and it's just blooming and taking over.
We love net zero things. That's awesome. Perfect. And we'll go to Areef next.
Yeah, so I think, as I said in the earlier question, the key thing is that the programs have been in market for a long period of time. And so they have evolved. Have they evolved as much as those of us who are pushing for more to be done well enough is another question. But they've certainly evolved. One thing, the utility programs and the other programs still remain very prescriptive. And if we can maybe talk about that later in the impact of having prescriptive programs, which means I'm just going to give you this, this, and this, irrespective of what you need. So that continues to be a big challenge, certainly in those of us who are working on the fringes of making things happen. The BC provincial government has just launched a new program, as I mentioned, and I think that gives us great hope, because it's substantial amounts of money relatively. So just to give you an example, I think, well, one of the things that happened as soon as greener homes came in is, of course, the price of heat pumps and things like that went up by about the same amount that the grant came in. So that's always a market force issue that is challenging. But it's interesting that a typical heat pump, whole house heat pump here, it costs about $13,000 to get installed. And I think people would get at a particular income level almost, well, they get 95% of it, and they'd have to find about $600 or $700. So it's achievable, but still not free. So I think not everybody in the lower income people has $750 in their pockets, but it's a good move towards. So I think that is, helping a lot of will help, and these programs can be layered on top of each other, including the greener homes program, if people can afford it. So I think that's a really good development in our province.
It's great to hear. We don't always hear about increases in funding, so that's a good story. And so next we'll go to Jacqueline for this one.
Thanks. So like Areef mentioned for BC, and as I mentioned sort of in my first answer, the good news is that we've got pieces in place in Ontario for energy poverty programs. So we do have energy conservation programs that are divided on the electricity and the gas side. So it's called the EAP currently for electricity, and the gas demand side management for gas. We have consumer protection rules. We've got on-bill rate assistance program, and we have emergency assistance. So we've got different pieces of the sort of energy poverty puzzle in place. And the other good news is that all of these programs have now survived at least one change in government. So they're sort of established to a certain extent, and that's a very good news story.
Yeah, that's huge. That longevity is good to have. And then last person with this question, we'll go to Edmundo.
Yeah, so here in Newfoundland, actually, we have fairly well-known grants and incentive programs that are delivered through the local electrical utility, and they're marketed very heavily. You know, you hear them in the radio, you see them on TV. Often one of the big ones is actually air sealing, and kind of how much we lose to that in some of the windy areas within Newfoundland. And I would say that the general subscription to them it's fairly good. I think there's general also political interest and political acknowledgement that energy efficiency is something that is needed, and that it's something that we do have programs as well for low income, as it was mentioned before, and some assistance on utility bills as well. There's still a lot to be done, and I think one of the things that is coming along, it's actually some of the dissociation of some of the efforts towards net zero and the energy efficiency in some sense. Whenever you end up reaching a province with very low carbon emissions from the electricity grid, then all of a sudden driving efficiency in electricity doesn't give you that path towards net zero. So all of a sudden it becomes parallel conversations in some tables, and we're starting to see some of that. But generally there is good ongoing engagement with the industry. We're working currently with our industry association on kind of finding out what else can we do in addition to our utility programs, as well as our government vulnerable populations assistance programs that exist.
Perfect. Thanks, Edmundo. So one more question for me, and then we're going to go to some audience questions. So just a reminder, you can put your questions in the Q&A tool, and you can also give a thumbs up if there's a question that you would really like to see answered. So for our last question here, it's a two-parter. So for the panelists, I have two questions for you. So first, what might not be working so well in your province? And the second part is, how could we address some of these problems or improve some of the barriers that might be in the way of your programs? And so for our first answer, we're going to go to Areef.
Okay. Those of you who know me know this is my broken record story. I'm old enough to remember the start of DSM programs. And what we seem to forget is DSM programs started that were utility centric. And they were all focused on creating lots of energy or taking lots of energy from, little bits of energy from a lot of people. I think we're way past it. All our programs still continue, particularly in the low income area, to be utility or government centric. I think we have to change that around if we're going to get anywhere in terms of actually making a difference in people's bills, and more importantly, also on emissions. So I think that's not really being done well. It's, you'll have this whether you need it or not. Whatever you need, we're not interested. I think if we move to that kind of model, we're in a much better position to pull funding from different players who all have different interests in upgrading the house. Whereas currently we're strapped by either utility commissions or provincial governments. Whereas I think if we take a holistic view, look at this house, what can be done better with that, and move forward for it. And there are examples where this has worked really well, and the cost has actually been lower in many cases than the current cost of programs. So that, I think, is the big issue in my mind of what's not working well.
Perfect. Thanks so much. And then we'll go to Jacqueline.
Thanks. One kind of frame that I wanted to raise on this panel is that I think we need to start thinking about energy poverty issues as a human rights issue. You have a human right to adequate and affordable housing. You have a human right to a safe and healthy environment. It's not about sort of like a moral imperative or anything like that, or it is too, but it's a human right that you have. And these programs need to be kind of understanding the core basic problem at issue here and respecting that. I have lots of issues I'd love to discuss, so I'll maybe just raise some of them. One big issue in Ontario is that one of the ways that they calculate what is owed in terms of energy is based on a policy decision to allocate costs based on density. So transmission lines and distribution systems need to be upgraded. There's big infrastructure costs, but the way that that's allocated across the province is, in our view, very unfair to people that live in less dense areas of the province. So people living in less dense areas then have much, much higher energy bills because of these transmission and distribution costs. And that's a policy decision about how to allocate that across the province. So that can be changed. Uptake is a big concern, of course. Our understanding is that the financial assistance programs have a bit better name recognition than the energy efficiency programs. So there's work to be done on that front. But in any event, all of these programs, we need to work on reaching the right people. Ontario also, actually, just like what Areef said, so it's the same problem, but it's focused on, electricity efficiency programs and gas efficiency programs. So there's a couple of problems with that. One is that, of course, it's not centered or focused on the actual person in energy poverty. So one, it doesn't cover other fuel types, which is a huge problem in Ontario. There's lots of people, particularly in more rural places in Northern Ontario, on First Nations, that use other fuels. So wood, propane, and oil are still fuel types that are used and are just simply not covered yet. And so that's a problem. And then the fuel switching problem is also an issue in Ontario. There's no real way to do that. And I guess the last one I just wanted to raise, actually there's two more, if I may. One is data access. So this was well laid out in Efficiency Canada's report. So that's great, but we have a data access problem in Ontario too. So we need more. We need to know who is accessing the programs, where, what type of housing it is, because without that, we're kind of making educated guesses about where the problem lies in uptake. So that's a big problem. And the final one I wanted to address, and that's close to our hearts at the Canadian Environmental Law Association, where I work as part of LEAN, is that there are other, along with the structural issues that you can have in homes that bar people from taking part in these programs, you can also have really serious indoor environmental issues like mold in a lot of these inadequate houses. And we need to just reorient the programs. We need to change the way that they're framed so that these issues can be dealt with. They can be, part of the solution. And, you're again, then not just leaving people with this double burden of having, homes with mold and then that are inefficient as well. So that's just a reorientation of what we're trying to accomplish with the programs.
Awesome. Thanks, Jacqueline. Yeah, as someone who spent a lot of time cutting firewood for my family growing up, there are definitely still homes heating with firewood across Ontario. And so next we'll go to Edmundo.
Yeah, so thank you. And I'll try not to reflect previous worded thoughts. I find actually most of the current programs, I think the transition is being made towards relying on an energy audit before you can access the financing. I think, well, that is obviously a benefit in some ways. It actually seems to, at least in our jurisdiction, it actually slow down uptake in some cases, or actually being able to do the energy retrofits. Another thing, usually from an auditor's perspective, is that you don't want to rank the recommendations for the resident, right? So ultimately, the resident ends up doing what is best for them anyway, with regards to what they were looking at in the program. So I sometimes question what is the benefit of the energy audit at every step from all the different programs, and I think that could be streamlined in some ways. And maybe there's some retrofits that do require energy audits, or some retrofits that maybe don't require them so much. But I think, and that goes to my other comment, that actually energy efficiency, while it's definitely a technical energy problem, it's also very much a financial problem too, and a financial conversation for the resident, right? Like one thing that we're talking about before was the capacity of a household to take on debt. And, PACE financing, sometimes it actually will tie it to the residents versus a person. And there is a lot of different, through HELOCs, through different financial mechanisms, there's different ways to actually help people get out of that weird financial corner that energy poverty puts them in, of the heat or eat type decisions. So I think we just need to get a little bit creative about maybe linking a little bit of the financial advice type tools and the financial education in the country along with energy efficiency, as opposed to treating them as two different conversations where energy efficiency is a technical solution and then the financial piece is just a quick return on investment, which is more often than not actually much more complicated and much more entrenched in the household's cash flow. The other parts is like, I want, the amount of grants and the way that they're being delivered it's something that obviously could be improved in some ways, and it could be maximized, but I think that goes jurisdiction by jurisdiction. One thing that I would like to see changing in my jurisdiction in the future would be actually currently, because the programs are being delivered through the utilities, the utility by policy has to be very conservative in their financial decisions to invest in energy efficiency. And because of that, that means whenever they offer financing or benefits to the residents, if it has a loan kind of component to it, they have to be very financially conservative, and they usually lean very heavily on your credit score. And coming out of a global pandemic, a lot of people may have struggled to pay their credit card, or may have struggled to pay some of the ancillary payments to their cash flow in their household, but they've been paying their utility and they've been paying their municipal taxes. So what is really what is truly the definition of somebody who may or may not pay a reduced utility bill or a reduced collective bill for the retrofits of their homes and live in a healthier, improved, more efficient home? I think it's up for discussion, especially in the context that we're currently after the pandemic. I think earlier in the conversation, it was mentioned, that the grants don't really get currently a deep energy retrofits. And what I found most often than not, it's that it will subsidize the cost of the technology, which is great. It's obviously a great support, but it doesn't really help often in the setup to be able to implement the technology. A case that we often see, or that I often hear about, is, I'll get subsidized to put the insulation, but not to put the framing to install the insulation in the basement. And that can be a very limiting factor for, obviously, if the program for the vulnerable doesn't cover it, then for them, or for the people in energy poverty, but actually for those who are slipping into it as well. It often seems to not let them catch up before they ending up in the situation where they're now dependent on the programs that fully subsidize the retrofits. So I think there's an in-between there that we could improve. And specifically within Newfoundland and Labrador, I would love to see the amendment of a policy to the Municipal Act to enable municipalities to have the discussion about PACE financing or using the municipal tax system to support different residents. Municipalities through the pandemic were known to be able to make fairly quick decisions to deliver relief on municipal taxes or different bills to residents, while some other levels of government can be a little bit more political and take a little bit more time. And in the worst case scenario, it's just an additional tool, right? Like to me, it's enabling the municipality to have that conversation and discuss that bylaw and decide what to do with those programs could do nothing but help in the future.
Perfect. And for the last word on this, we'll go to Thea.
Thanks. Areef, I would echo your comments. We have a program in the government that gives out thousands of dollars for structural upgrades, and it's not, we tried about 4 years ago to connect our two programs together and we were not successful. So we've uncoupled them, but I'm hoping that we can go back and be very intentional in how they get connected. And then also adding very, very strange small things like, if your attic is full of Christmas decorations, we will pay to have somebody go up there and remove your Christmas decorations and place them somewhere for you so that then we can insulate the attic. Just those little tiny things that weren't in the program before really help enable people uptake the programs. I would just quickly say that tenant programs, we need to talk about having programs for tenants. Contractor training on the island, we went from last year, we just took on the building code, the national building code. So we're going from like just adopting the national building code for the first time ever straight to model energy code. So there's a lot of gaps to fill there. And then truly implementing diversity and equity practices actually like really in the details and the finesse of how we deliver these programs. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. We have lots and lots of audience questions and not a lot of time. So I'm just going to jump straight in. I see Abby's also been answering questions, which is awesome. So Abby, I'll invite you to turn your video back on. And our top question here, and anybody who wants to answer can jump in. Where in the world outside of Canada do you find deep energy retrofits that bring people out of energy poverty?
I think certainly in the United States, many of the states have the weatherization program that's been going for certainly a couple of decades, I believe, but they haven't just created the program, right? They have a network of trained contractors and auditors. They have a structure, whereas here we go, oh, what's missing? Financing. Well, let's bring that in, right? And let's load debt onto lower income people. I mean, that's just crazy to me. I hope it doesn't happen. But so I think that's one area. Philadelphia has had a great program. The paper is available. It's called Comfort Smart. Amazing, amazing program where the people that went into the houses were given the ability to see what was needed. They had a way to do the analysis to see whether what they were thinking was cost effective. And so they did everything that was cost effective. It was an Alberta program that Campbell ran a couple of years ago, which was very similar. What's needed, right? And then see if it fits the financial model rather than the other way around, because there's a lot of wastage when you do that. So there are lots of examples. You know, if anybody wants more information, please feel free to get in touch with me.
And then, so another question here, are there examples of collaborative programs that leverage funding outside of energy efficiency? So maybe a program that also looks at healthcare or even for-profit sectors funding to support energy efficiency along with non-energy benefits. So combining not just the energy focus, but, you know, other aspects that we're trying to reach.
Can I jump in again? I mean, if anybody else wants to. Yeah, so I don't think there are many formal programs, but the other organization within Campbell, Community Power, has been working this kind of model with Indigenous communities because the housing is in such a bad state. So Community Power essentially looks at what's required in terms of the house, combines energy, gets money from Indigenous services, gets money from or funds from the utilities and from other government departments wherever appropriate, to create the upgrades of the home, both in terms of health and safety, as well as energy efficiency. And that overcomes the enabling funding that's required. But there doesn't seem to be some cohesion at any level of government to make this happen. So we as a social enterprise are doing that because otherwise these things just would not happen. You cannot put insulation into an attic that's wet because the roof is leaking, right? It's the simplest example, but there's so many examples like that out there. So the only way we can do it is to take the initiative ourselves.
Yeah, and I would support that thought on actually a lot of our conversations have been around, obviously the utility deliver programs are valuable in some cases, the infrastructure deliver programs are valuable in other cases. One thing that we're talking quite a bit about is, is there a role for a third party to actually help navigate some of these programs if they can't just pull themselves together in a very cohesive way, and that's partially sometimes because they're trying to achieve different objectives, but having I don't know if it's a coordinator or a type of convener or kind of advisor from both the technical as well as the financial aspect of things seems to have little sparks popping around Canada of those frameworks, and I'm glad to hear that is a similar model to what Community Power is doing.
So we had, for 2 years, we had a fully funded low-income program that did insulation, windows and doors and equipment and ventilation. I'm losing my words here, but and it was working and it wasn't working. And so we shut it down for a whole bunch of reasons. And we did a postmortem afterwards with all of the people, or at least people that represented all of the people that were connected to the program. And the postmortem was framed as a postmortem, but it was also said like, so now what? We did that, it didn't work. What are we doing now? What's the next thing? And the biggest theme that came out of that meeting was onboarding the client. This process where you sit with the client and you say, what is happening in your home? What do you need? And then very, very, very clearly explaining, this is the program that I have that's going to do these things for you. These are the people that are going to show up at your home. This is what they look like. This is what they're called. This is what's going to happen at the end. And because you've also identified that you need these other things happening in your home, I'm going to connect you with this other program, this other person. Her name's Mary. She's going to call you. And making sure that there's informed consent all the way along the way, but that first really, really heavy onboarding up front to make sure that they're connected to all the right pieces, that we don't have to do it 2 or 3 or 4 times over the course of their engagement with the service organization. So now that's where we're at right now, is developing, what do those tools look like? Are they visual? Is there a video that explains all of this? Who are they connecting to? Is it people in their community? Do they have to come to me? Can it be a phone conversation? All of the details of how we record that with, we take the data responsibly, and who it's given to and how it's given to them to make sure that they can move through the program in a way that at the end is transformative, that they're engaged with their home, that they love their home, that they feel empowered, instead of, somebody came and fixed my house because I have a broken house. And, the programs could be so much more.
Yeah, that's awesome. So we are at 1:45, but I'm going to be a little bit selfish and just ask one more question, because I think the question's a really important piece of our equity conversations, but I'm just going to ask everyone to keep your answers a little bit brief. How common is it for info about energy efficiency programs to be available in other languages besides English? Is this typically left to a municipality or regional authority to provide translations? Areef, I know you have some thoughts about this, and then maybe Jacqueline, working in Toronto with so many different languages, any examples are really helpful to hear.
I think I speak reasonably good English, but I struggle with some of the forms that the bureaucracy throws at me. So I can understand totally what it's like to be a non-fluent English speaker. In BC, there's some attempt at that. We have, I think, Empower Me has been working in BC since 2014, where we're providing energy efficiency information in a number of languages, and in BC and in Alberta. But I think it's a real issue. I mean, we saw that during COVID, when you don't translate or don't provide information. It's not about translation. It's about getting people from the community to actually go and provide that information so that there's trust there. Because lots of people come from different places and they don't necessarily believe government or authority messages. And so I think it's a real gap, seeing the population of Canada has changed dramatically. And this next census, which has shown us already how important this is. But we seem to it seems to be yeah, it's a great idea, but there's no action, or the action is very, very limited. So I think it's a real issue that we really need to push. And it's the same for Aboriginal people. The information, particularly people in remote communities, they don't have access to the internet. And yet lots of stuff is available. So I think it's a real issue, but it comes back to program design. right? Putting a mindset on that says, how do we design these programs for these people, not for the people that we know? I think it's mindset and leadership is the real key crux to this issue.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add because I totally agree with Areef, but Abby and I sit on an advisory panel at the IESO, so looking at the electricity side efficiency programs. And this is an issue that we talk about a lot there. So it's on people's minds, and they do translate some materials. But one of the things I'd mention is, one, again, it's not only translation, it's about like trusted community people providing the information, right? Like me handing out a form that I can't understand because I don't speak a different language is really not that helpful because you can't like follow up in any way. And it's also, again, about the data piece. So we need to also identify like what languages we're talking about, which communities, like what are we really talking about in a place like Toronto or other like big cities or smaller places, and then design our programs for that. And what that means is there has to be a big budget for it, right? This is a big deal. And if one of the huge gaps that's been identified in all of our programs is uptake, then this is what we need to do to improve uptake.
Only one thing I'll add to what both the panelists said was that this is an opportunity for cities to participate in low-income energy efficiency programs in a very easy way, is connecting your community members to existing ongoing provincial programs by providing that sort of like mediation translation services in between, so that folks who typically hard to reach communities can better access these programs. Yes, they're downstream from like being very careful about program design, but people need help today, and when they need help today, they don't know where to go, and cities can play a role at the moment. I wouldn't overlook that.
Kirstin, can I just say one quick point? This is not about just saying to people, I have a program and I'll talk to you in your language. People don't know, who come from other countries, necessarily know what energy efficiency is, why I should care, why is the government giving me money? So it's a long road, and that is just not understood, that we've all been soaked in energy efficiency for the last 20, 30 years. Many people just haven't, and they don't understand why. What's the catch? So there's got to be an understanding that this will take time to happen, and it's not just a one flash in the pan issue.
Yeah, we found something similar, sorry, in Ontario, just to add to that. You're dealing with a real skepticism about a program, right? Like people don't believe you for very good reason, right? You're dealing with, low-income people. They're, marginalized for many different reasons. They're structurally marginalized. So when you show up and say, like, I've got this free energy efficiency program, like people don't believe you and don't know what you're talking about, and it isn't a good way in. So that whole context needs to be understood in designing these outreach programs.
Yeah, I would definitely say that that's something that we're finding as well. Like there's skepticism. Also, in some cases, people are skeptic of the utility or the agenda behind the utility, even if there is a positive agenda, they're just skeptics. So one thing that we've discussed as maybe a potential solution, and to try to eliminate the conversation about, well, this is about climate change or this is about energy efficiency. It's actually talking about household finance and household cash flow, and this is about helping you kind of understand, because in the same conversation that you can understand energy efficiency and long-term investment in your own property, you can be talking a lot about a lot of things that we found in various other programs that our residents could use some conversations about, like RSSPs, TFSAs, the whole holistic conversation about, if I invest in here, like, is my expense going to pop up over here in my cash flow and end up in the same situation or in the worst situation? And I think we're seeing a little bit of that conversation actually even in the chat, right? If I do this, am I going to end up paying it if I electrify, I'm going to pay in my gas bill. Similar, I think it happens if I take a loan or I take this free money, like, am I all of a sudden not eligible for another program, which is often the case in some of these particularly vulnerable populations programs, that if you take this money, now you can't ask for this other money. And that, I think that is to me, while that is obviously in the agenda of energy efficiency, that is a financial conversation at the household level that definitely could have additional support, and that could be a very good entry point, in my opinion, and some of the folks that have been speaking to you, for energy efficiency and really ultimately, like, you're buying comfort, but really you're buying savings. Like, this is what people care about, right? Like, and even as a corporate operation, that's what we care about whenever somebody comes in to put a new technology in our facility. We're looking at, like, what are the savings for the operation? while maintaining level of comfort, not the other piece of the conversation so much.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. I don't want to cut it off, but we got to cut it off. This is really, really interesting. I feel like I know a lot about energy poverty, and I learned so much in this conversation about the different contexts and the different challenges all across Canada. So, Abby, are you raising a hand, or are you just saying goodbye? Perfect. Okay. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everyone who joined. I appreciate all of your time and your thoughts. The recording will be online soon, and I hope everyone has an amazing rest of your day. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Thank you, everybody.